But basically what you're saying is look, we know how this movie plays out, and we're still at the start of it, unemployment wise, right? That you're not going to see the Fed, because it has to slay the inflation dragon. It's not going to pivot here when unemployment is still so low. If we're going to see, some sort of semblance of what broke the back of inflation under the Volcker rules, inflation is probably going to have to be a lot higher here before the Fed feels pressured to pivot, at least by that alone. Did I summarize your position correctly?
I think that I think inflation has peaked. I think the July numbers coming out next week will decline. The market probably will respond favorably, thinking the Fed for sure will pivot. But we've also seen some of those inflationary commodities bounce back towards the later part of the month. And I think that's also partly due to the stronger equity markets, the stronger bond markets. I think that you could see the data that comes out for August and September not necessarily go down any bit more than what we see next week. And it may even tick up a little. And I don't think the market's going to respond really well if we start to see an uptick after one down month. The real issue is the consumer, especially the low-end consumer, and companies are going to be affected by high inflation, even if inflation is at 5%. That's a historically high level. And I think that the longer term problem that we're going to have, and why I think we're in a bear market, and it's a bear market that really hasn't seen earnings destruction. The S&P earnings estimates have remained rather high. So I don't think we've seen the earnings problems come back into the frame. And if I remember back in 2000, the Q2 numbers for earnings came out a little better, and it was a big relief for the market, much like what we just saw with earnings and what we're seeing right now with Q2 earnings. It's almost like, oh, better than feared. Oh, great. It could have been worse.
Right.
And
they're still bad, just not as bad as we all feared. Right?
But then in October, things got really bad in 2000. And you had some really major companies guiding down just because it didn't bounce back. And maybe all these companies have just, found every penny in the couches of the lobbies of whatever, their offices to throw at a good earnings report this quarter. And look, there's mega cap tech. They have a lot of levers they can pull to increase numbers. That's a stabilizing factor for the NASDAQ especially. But I think you're also, we could be peaking with some of the energy names as well.
All right, so let's just talk a bit about kind of how bad things could get. So you're concerned that, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, but correct them in any way. You're concerned about margin compression, or a profits recession here, as companies are getting squeezed by declining demand, right? As prices get so high that just organic demand destruction begins to go on. Plus, there's the demand destruction that's being actively pursued by the Fed by raising the cost of capital, right? So the cost of financing for these companies is getting more expensive. So both of those kind of compressed margins, they decrease economic activity, right? And I believe that that's your concern about why we're heading into a recession here, is because inflation's bringing demand down, but the Fed is actively pushing harder and harder on the brakes, trying to additionally get demand down even further, right? And then there's the whole issue of, maybe this is a policy mistake where the Fed pumps the brakes too hard, and by the time the policy, impact hits in 9 months or however long it takes from now, we could be in a bad recession, and the hitting impact of the delayed impact of what the Fed's doing could make things even worse at that point in time, right? So there's the question of how bad could this recession be, and I think you just said earlier, really aren't that many pleasant recessions. There aren't that many shallow recessions we have to point to. So there's that, and if you could also, in your answer, just address layoffs. How bad do you think they could get? Because that's the magic talisman that the Fed and a lot of the current leaders of the administration are waving to say, don't worry, jobs are really good. But as you and I just talked about, that could change pretty quickly. Do you expect the type of layoffs that we've seen in the past, either in '08 or in the dot-com bust?
So I well, I can't speculate that it's going to be as high as those periods, because you actually, there were a couple things that were happening with technology. And technology, in the dot-com bust, you had this boom bust, but everything sort of shifted over to the housing markets, and Greenspan kept rates real low and created another bubble with the housing world. Now, going back to 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, that was of course, the next bubble to burst. But I think you had this huge productivity boom. And I will say, I think it was mainly due to technology and the iPhone and new technologies that were really becoming part of our lives. I mean, if you go back and you think in 2009, okay, we were just coming into the new iPhone world. How many companies grew out of the iPhone on mobile? And you can look at and say, well, Facebook, when they pivoted to mobile, they took off. Uber, all these delivery apps, just so many different things. I don't see that technology boom coming anytime soon. And that to me says that the recession can be longer until there's another manifestation of technology that we're going to embrace. The other thing is, again, we haven't seen earnings compress. We haven't seen margins compress enough. And that usually is a longer term, let's say 1 year, 4-quarter, I mean, maybe even 6 quarters. And I think that's the same thing when it comes to unemployment. Once you get it turning, it typically keeps going. And I think we're at an incredibly good level at this point. And I just don't see it getting any better. I think it's only going to get worse. And again, it takes time. So I can't speculate on how high it can go, but the Fed will probably hit the panic button at 5%, and it may even go to 6%. And I think that'll be really felt in the markets. And so people are thinking, oh, well, the Fed's going to come in and they're going to pivot, they're going to cut rates. They're already planning, there's probabilities of rate cuts in 2023, and maybe that's going to happen. But what if it doesn't work? What if the Fed's actions don't really do what's happened in the past?
Mm-hmm.
Because you need that longer term earnings slowdown. You need to reset earnings a lot lower, and you don't have technology that's going to bail you out with new innovations, new companies. So yeah, I'm like Mr. Bearish today. I'm sorry, it's Monday. Really sorry about that. But here's the other thing. There are opportunities on the long side to find, and you just have to pick your spots. And there'll be bear market rallies, and maybe we're just going to be in a sideways pattern for a couple of years. And that happened in the 70s. Also, a time when we had very high inflation, political instability, and a difficult situation with oil. So that, I think, is my scenario is we're going to be in a sideways choppy pattern for possibly the next couple of years.
If you enjoyed this video clip, click here to watch another one you should like.